first thing anyone noticed that morning was the smell. Not smoke, not frost. Something in between, sharp and green, drifting over a county that had just lost its entire fruit crop in a single night. Thousands of blossoms hung blackened on the branches. Peaches that had been swelling towards summer sat frozen and split open on the ground. Apple buds curled brown at the edges like burnt paper. Families stood in rows they had planted themselves, some of them crying without trying to hide it, some just staring, the way people stare at a car wreck they can't quite process yet. Insurance adjusters pulled up in white trucks with clipboards. A local news helicopter circled twice over the valley, its blades cutting through air that still smelled faintly of ice. Farmers who had spent 3 generations on this land walked their rows counting, losses that no calculator could soften. Then someone pointed toward the ridge above the county road. One orchard was still green. Not damaged green. Not partially green, but partially green. Fully alive, blossoms intact, leaves standing upright like nothing had happened at all. Within an hour, half the county had driven up that hill to see it for themselves. The guesses started immediately. Maybe he'd installed some kind of expensive frost system. Maybe he had government funding nobody else got. Maybe there was a greenhouse cover hidden somewhere, or some chemical spray the big commercial growers used. People wanted an explanation that made sense, something that matched the scale of the disaster everyone else had just lived through. What they found instead were old wool blankets. Stained, faded, some of them patched with mismatched thread, wrapped around tree after tree in careful, practiced folds. Nobody laughed this time. 3 months earlier, plenty of people had. To understand how a stack of worn-out blankets outperformed an entire county's worth of modern equipment, you have to go back to a boy who learned about winter the hard way, long before he ever owned an orchard of his own. Elias Turner was 11 years old when his parents died on an icy stretch of highway, delivering apples to a market 2 counties over during a storm nobody had planned for. He survived that morning for one reason. His grandfather had kept him home to help cover the young pear trees before the weather turned. At the funeral, people kept telling him how lucky he was. A neighbor patted his shoulder and murmured something about how fate works in strange ways. His grandfather, standing a few feet off with his hat in his hands, said something quieter that stuck with Elias for the rest of his life. "The trees saved him," the old man said. "Not luck, not fate. The trees." After that, his grandfather didn't start him on pruning shears or tractor work the way most farm boys got started. He started him on watching. They'd sit on the porch in the evening, and his grandfather would point at a bird landing low in the grass instead of high in a tree, and ask Elias what that might mean. He'd have him press a hand to the bark of an apple tree in October and describe what he felt. He taught him to notice when the air went still, in a way that felt different from ordinary calm, and what a moon halo looked like the night before a hard freeze. The old man owned almost nothing worth mentioning. A truck older than Elias, a drawer of wool blankets that had outlived at least 2 households, rusted shears he sharpened by hand, a thermometer with a crack running through the glass that somehow still worked. Every winter, without fail, he wrapped the youngest trees in those blankets. The neighbors thought it was a strange, old-fashioned habit, the kind of thing a man does out of superstition more than sense. He never explained himself when they teased him about it. Some lessons only make sense after a bad spring, was all he'd say, folding the wool with the same care he might have used on a good coat. Years passed. The old man died the way farmers often do, quietly in the middle of an ordinary week, and Elias inherited land he thought he already understood. He was wrong about that almost immediately. The first hard frost after his grandfather's death, Elias wrapped the trees the way he remembered, or thought he remembered. Days later, he found mold creeping along several branches where the wool had trapped too much moisture against damp bark. He'd wrapped too tight, sealed in dampness instead of warmth, and lost a section of young trees to rot he could have prevented. The next season he tried plastic instead, reasoning it would hold heat better than old fabric. By mid-morning, the sun had turned the wraps into greenhouses, and bark that wasn't built for that kind of heat split down the trunk in long, ugly cracks. Another set of trees gone, another lesson paid for in dollars he didn't have to spare. He tried again the following autumn, wrapping earlier in the season to get ahead of the weather. Mice found the insulation before winter even set in properly, nesting inside the folds and knowing through bark he'd spent years training into shape. By his fourth attempt, he'd narrowed his focus to just the trunks, thinking that was where the real vulnerability lived. The trunks survived fine. The buds above them froze anyway, and that year's fruit set dropped to almost nothing. Down at the diner, a neighbor started calling him the tree tailor, joking that at this rate he'd be knitting sweaters for the squirrels next. The whole counter laughed, and to his credit, Elias laughed along with them. He kept a running list on his kitchen wall of everything that had gone wrong, and he kept trying. Slowly through failure rather than instruction, the pieces started coming together. Wool works because the fibers trap air without sealing out moisture, letting a tree breathe while still holding a little of its own warmth close. Timing matters because wrap too early and pests move in. Wrap too late and the damage is already done. Frost forms worst on clear, still nights, when heat radiates straight up off the ground with nothing to hold it in place. Blossoms are the most fragile part of any fruit tree, thin-walled and full of water. Freezing at temperatures the woodier parts of the tree can shrug off without much trouble. None of it came to him in a lecture. It came in burned branches and wasted money and the particular kind of learning that only shows up after you've already paid for the mistake. Around the same time, Elias was rebuilding his own understanding, one failed season at a time. The rest of the county was moving in a very different direction. Investors began buying up land nearby and modernizing everything at once. Weather apps promised frost warnings down to the hour. Satellite monitoring tracked soil temperature across entire acreages. Drones flew over orchards checking bud development from angles no human eye could match. Expensive frost alarms went up on poles, ready to text a farmer the second the mercury dropped too low. The talk around town shifted fast. Old-style farming was finished, people said. Why trust a feeling in your gut when you could trust a satellite? Elias started to wonder if they were right. His own children encouraged him to sell and move somewhere easier. The bank sent letters about refinancing that read more like pressure than help. A developer's offer sat on his kitchen table for weeks, tempting enough that he came closer to signing it than he ever told anyone. What stopped him was a notebook he found while clearing out his grandfather's old workbench, its cover soft with age, its pages filled with handwriting that had gotten shakier toward the end. He expected some kind of secret method inside, a formula he'd been missing all along. Instead, he found decades of small, plain observations. When robins stay low after sunset. When the stars sharpen too early in the evening. Blankets only work if the tree still holds yesterday's warmth. Page after page of things a man had simply noticed, year after year, without ever writing down a single shortcut. There was no magic in it. Just attention, kept up for longer than most people have the patience for. Late March came in warm that year, warmer than anyone expected. The forecasts all agreed, a full week of mild weather rolling in, and the county treated it like a gift. Trees bloomed early across the valley. Families brought their kids out to walk the orchards. A blossom festival went up in the town square, and phones filled with pictures of pink and white branches against a clear blue sky. Elias noticed things nobody else seemed to. No insects moving in the evening air when there should have been plenty. A stillness that didn't feel like ordinary calm. A dry, faint smell drifting down off the ridge that his grandfather used to call the smell before the cold. He started wrapping trees again. Not all of them, just the most exposed and youngest ones, the way his grandfather always had. He pulled every wool blanket he owned out of storage, along with old quilts, army surplus wool, even a couple of worn horse blankets from the barn, anything breathable enough to hold a little warmth without smothering the bark. A group of teenagers filmed him doing it, and posted the video online with a caption about Grandpa fighting winter with Grandma's old bedding. It spread fast. Millions of people watched a tired old man wrap trees and blankets while the forecast called for warm, easy weather. Radio hosts made jokes about it during the morning show. Even people who liked Elias started asking, gently, if he'd finally lost his grip on things. Maybe was all he said back, and kept folding wool. There's something almost funny about wisdom, the way it so often looks foolish, right up until the moment it doesn't. If you've ever kept doing something you believed, and while everyone around you laughed, you already understand exactly what Elias was feeling on that hillside. It's worth sitting with that feeling for a second, because the hardest part of his story hadn't even arrived yet, and it's the kind of thing worth staying around for. The temperature started dropping the following night, slowly at first, then all at once. Ice crystals began forming on blades of grass that had been green and soft just hours earlier. The usual night sounds disappeared. No crickets, no distant dogs, nothing but a silence so complete it felt like the whole valley was holding its breath. Generators failed on more than one farm. Winged machines that were supposed to keep cold air moving sputtered and stalled in the deep freeze. Some farmers lit smudge pots and stood watch over the flames. Some just stood in their orchards doing nothing at all, having run out of options hours earlier. A few, without much hope left, prayed. Elias walked his rows tree by tree, checking knots, tightening a loose wrap here, adjusting a blanket that had slipped there. He talked to the trees under his breath, the same way his grandfather used to, low and steady, not because the trees could hear him, but because it kept his own hands from shaking. By the time the sky started to lighten, nobody in the county knew whether the blankets had done anything at all, or whether Elias had simply lost his last crop along with everybody else. The sun came up on total silence. No engine starting, no conversation, just a low crunch of boots on frozen ground as people walked out to see what the night had left behind. Orchard after orchard told the same story. Black blossoms, split fruit, whole seasons of work gone in a single frost. Families who had been laughing at a blossom festival 2 days earlier now stood crying in the same rows. Phones rang non-stop with insurance calls. Kids too young to understand the scale of it asked their parents why everybody looked so sad. Then, up on the ridge, someone noticed a patch of green that hadn't turned. Word spread fast, and people began driving up to see it for themselves. Elias was already out there, pulling blankets off tree after tree, revealing blossoms that had somehow made it through the night untouched. Tiny fruit was already starting to form on branches that should have been frozen, solid like everything else around them. Nobody said much. Even the birds seemed unusually loud in a silence that heavy. It wasn't a perfect outcome. Some of his trees hadn't made it either, a fact he never tried to hide from the people who came asking. But enough had survived to save his own farm, and more than that, to help his neighbors start rebuilding. He gave away seedlings that spring. He handed out scion wood for grafting. He shared what fruit he had instead of trying to sell it at the kind of price a disaster like that would have easily supported. A county agricultural scientist came out a few weeks later to study what had actually happened on his land, curious whether wool blankets alone could really explain the difference. What she found went well beyond fabric. Ilias's soil had been built up over decades with careful, patient management. His trees were properly spaced, pruned with an eye toward airflow, mulched heavily enough to hold moisture and warmth in the ground itself. Windbreaks he'd planted years earlier broke up the coldest gusts before they ever reached the trunks. His root systems ran deep and strong, the product of years of steady, unglamorous care. The blankets had helped, no question. But they'd only been protecting something that decades of quiet work had already built. As the scientist put it in her report, you can't wrap neglect in wool and expect a miracle. A year later, the mockery had mostly turned into something else. Young farmers started showing up at his gate asking questions instead of jokes. Local schools brought classes through on field trips. A university reached out for an interview, and eventually his grandfather's notebook found a permanent place in a small agricultural museum a few towns over. Ilias tells every visitor the same thing when they ask what to copy from him. "Don't copy my blankets," he says, and waits for the confused look that always follows. Then he smiles. "Copy my curiosity." One afternoon, a little girl, visiting with her school class, tugged at his sleeve and asked how he always seemed to know when frost was coming. He knelt down to her level, the way his grandfather might have, and handed her a blank notebook he kept in his coat pocket for exactly this kind of question. "You'll have to spend a lifetime answering that one yourself," he told her. She wandered off toward the young trees at the edge of the orchard, notebook in hand, already writing down something small she'd noticed about the way the leaves were turned that day. Behind her, the same rose that had nearly frozen a year earlier stood full of blossoms, quietly getting ready for another season nobody could fully predict.